Welcome to the Connor's Corner segment of Ask the Lawyer. As a lot of you know out there, we do our taping and broadcasting from Fifth Avenue in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. So we have this affinity for old Brooklyn Dodgers, and over the years we've brought a few back. But we're very pleased today to have one of the mainstays of the Brooklyn Dodgers in the late 40s into the 50s. In fact, he stayed with the Dodgers a little bit when they went to Los Angeles. But one of the heroes of the 1953 World Series, Carl Erskine. Welcome to the show, Carl.
Hey there. You know, what's wonderful is to hear not only from Brooklyn, but Bay Ridge.
Why Bay Ridge?
Where I lived for a few years, you bet.
So what do you remember about Bay Ridge?
Well, Betty and I were from Anderson, Indiana, which is a small community in the middle of Indiana. And coming to Brooklyn, the big city, was overwhelming. But once we got settled into Bay Ridge, it was like a small town. We knew the barber and the where the butcher was, and the bakery and the deli was all right there. And so quickly we felt really at home in Brooklyn, in Bay Ridge.
Let's go back a little bit in time. You were in the service during World War II. How did you get involved in professional baseball?
Well, when I graduated from high school, I'd been scouted by several scouts during my junior and senior year. But as soon as I graduated in 1945, I got drafted into the Navy because the war was hot in the South Pacific. And I had a brother in the South Pacific. We didn't know where he was, actually. But so I got my boot training in upstate New York because Great Lakes Naval Station was quarantined for something, scarlet fever, I think it was. So I went to a temporary war time training center on the Great Lakes, and I think it was Lake Geneva. That's where I got my boot training in the Navy. And then I was scheduled to go out on a carrier, and about a week before we were leave on the carrier, the bombs were dropped in Japan. And immediately everybody's orders were halted and stay where you are. And then eventually that led me to be sent to Boston Navy Yard, and I spent the rest of my Navy career in the Boston Navy Yard.
Now, how'd you get into baseball? Branch Rickey was the general manager of the Dodgers back then, right?
Right. Yeah. Here's a quick story. They scouted me in high school, and when before I got drafted in the Navy, when I was a senior, the Dodgers invited me to come to Ebbets Field and work out. And I got to do that and spent a week in New York, and they showed me this big city, and I worked out every day with the Dodgers. And that put the hook in me. I didn't want to play for anybody else after that. But then I had to go in the Navy. So a couple years later, this would have been I was still in the Navy, as a matter of fact. And Mr. Rickey came to the All-Star game in 1946, was in Boston. And he invited my parents to come to the All-Star game. And we met in the Kenmore Hotel the night before the 46 All-Star game, my dad, mother, and me with Mr. Rickey. And he signed me that night to my first contract. I was discharged a couple weeks later, and I went out and played a very short season in the minors, Danville, Illinois, because the season was almost over by the time I got out of the Navy. So after I got home, the commissioner of baseball called me, and he said, son, I want you and your father to come to my office in Cincinnati next Tuesday at 10 o'clock. So my dad laid off work, and we went to Cincinnati not knowing anything about what might happen here. And the commissioner said, son, the Dodgers violated a directive. They signed you before you were out of the military. And that was a wrongful act on part of the Dodgers. So I'm going to declare you a free agent. Now, Mr. Rickey had given me a $3,500 bonus. And so he was on the phone, asking the commissioner, what about the bonus? And the commissioner told him that's up to the boy, whatever he thinks is fair. Anyway, after that, I talked to Mr. Rickey, and I said, I do want to re-sign. They didn't bar the Dodgers from re-signing me, but they said you can sign with anybody. But I wanted to play for the Dodgers, so I told Mr. Rickey, if you give me another $5,000, I'll sign with the Dodgers. So he gave me 2 bonuses, and Mr. Rickey was known to be tight with the money. But when I told Dizzy Dean, who was a broadcaster, after I pitched a no-hitter against the Giants, he had me on the air, and he said, "Who signed you?" And I said, "Branch Rickey." He said, "He's the cheapest man ever lived." And I said, "Well, he gave me 2 bonuses." So he turned to the camera and he said, "Now this boy right here deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, not because he pitched 2 no-hitters. He got 2 bonuses from Branch Rickey." So I went down in the history book as getting 2 bonuses from Mr. Rickey, but it allowed me to play for one of the world, and boy, was I fortunate. It turned out that way.
Some of the younger people, by younger, even people under 50 or 60, may not even remember, one, there was a team in Brooklyn, and number 2, the Brooklyn Dodgers in the late 40s and early 50s, they were almost in every pennant race, and I know you had a couple of heartbreaks there in 50 and 51.
Oh, yeah. One of the most bitter experiences of my career was to lose in 1951. We had a 13.5 game lead in August, and one of the great teams, too, and the Giants began to catch us and finally tied us at the end of the season. And the National League had a rule: if teams tied, there would be a playoff of 2 out of 3. Now, so we got tied at the end of the season, and the playoffs started in Brooklyn. Our manager, on the flip of the coin, could decide to play the first game on the road and the next 2 games at home. But he decided to play the first game at home, and we got beat by the Giants, I think, 2 or 3 to 1. And then the next 2 games are going to be in the Polo Grounds. And Clem Labine shut the Giants out for the second game. Now the third game was for the pennant, for the whole ball of wax. And that's the game that Bobby Thompson hit the shot heard around the world and beat us. And it was a bitter pill. My goodness, how could we upset our fans again, not bring home the pennant after having that kind of a lead? But that's what happened. And the amazing thing about that team, we could have really collapsed after a bitter pill to swallow. But after the 51 season, 52 we won the pennant, 53 we won it, 55 we won the pennant and the series, 56 again we won the pennant. So that team was so good that even that bitter pill didn't shut them down to have a great run after that.
Now, when Bobby Thompson hit the home run off Ralph Branca, where were you?
I was in the bullpen. I'd been throwing alongside of Branca, and when the phone call came to the bullpen from Charlie Dressen, our coach, Clyde Sukeforth, answered the phone, and Dressen must have asked him if we were ready. And I heard him say, "They're both ready." And Henry must have asked him, who's throwing the best. So Sukeforth said, they both have good stuff, but Erskine's bouncing his curveball. Dressen said, "Let me have Branca." Well, tongue in cheek, I've said that was probably my best pitch in baseball.
Carl, we need to take a short break. You're listening to Ask the Lawyer with me, Mike Connors. We're talking to former Dodger great Carl Erskine. Welcome back to Ask the Lawyer with me, Mike Connors. We're in the Connors Corner segment of our show. We're talking to Carl Erskine, a pitcher who won 120 games for the Brooklyn Dodgers, once struck out 14 Yankees in a World Series game, pitched 2 no-hitters in his major league career, and we're sharing memories with Carl Erskine. Now, in 1953, you had a pretty good game in the World Series. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I was 20-6 that year and led the league in percentage, and so I was scheduled to open the '53 World Series in Yankee Stadium. So I was fine. I had no problem. I'd had a lot of arm trouble, but at that time my arm felt good. I was throwing well, and so I started the game. And lo and behold, I was a little wild the first inning, and I think Billy Martin tripled off of me in the first inning and knocked me out before I ever got a chance to pitch the game. So Dresden took me out, but he said to me, you didn't throw a lot of pitches, so I'm going to start you again in the third game. There's no travel day in New York with the two teams. Both game. Now, we'd already lost the first game and the second game in Yankee Stadium. So Duke Snyder was my roommate, and I told Duke when I went out to warm up, I said, Duke, I was supposed to get 3 starts in this series, and I've already blown one of them. I got to pitch like there's no tomorrow today and try to get us back in this series. So that day, I did have extra determination. I don't think I ever felt more determined to kind of come back from a defeat. And I've often told kids a defeat can be a great motivator. If it's so bitter, you don't want it to happen again. So I started pitching that game. It was a tight game. It went 1-1 and 2-2 late in the game. But I had good stuff, and Campy, he'd move his glove, I'd hit it. I had a good curveball that day. I didn't know how many strikeouts I had, but in the 9th inning, I struck out Bolwig, and then they sent it Big Johnny Mize. He was my nemesis. He'd hit a couple home runs off of me earlier in the seasons before, but I was fortunate to have a good curveball and kept it in the right place. I struck Mize out. I didn't hear the announcement about the record. Joe Collins was the next hitter, and he grounded out to me to end the game. So I went in the clubhouse, and Preacher Rowe, one of our pitchers, came over to me and said, Carl, he parted the writers were all around my locker. He parted the writers and said, Carl, do you realize you set a record today of 14 strikeouts? I said, Preacher, I never knew how many strikeouts I had. But I did have that many, and boy, what an overwhelming thrill to own a record in the World Series. That was so beyond my expectation in my career. But I just had good stuff that day, and it was on October 2nd in 1953. 10 years later, October 2nd, 1963, I sat in the stands at Yankee Stadium and watched Koufax strike out 15. So I had the record exactly 10 years.
Well, it's still a great record to have. Let me ask you, what was it like playing in the World Series back then, Yankees-Dodgers?
The World Series was an atmosphere that was really up there. People dressed. It was like the Easter parade at a World Series. Women dressed in furs, women dressed up in hats, men shirts and ties, suits. It was really a classy experience in the World Series in those days. And playing a World Series in Brooklyn, there was no travel day between the Yankees and the Dodgers. We had such a strong team, offense and defense. We probably didn't have as deep a pitching staff as the Yankees maybe had, but we never went into a World Series feeling like we were the underdogs. We always felt like it was going to be our day to win. And then for some strange reason, like it happens in sports, took us forever to finally beat the Yankees in a 4 out of 7 World Series. But that happened in '55, of course. And I'll tell you what, Brooklyn was always kind of a second-class citizen in baseball. the big Yankees and the strong Giants in the same city. But that 55 series, that elevated the Dodgers into having a classy team with real respect. And so I was extremely fortunate to be on that team.
What did it feel like for you as a player when the team moved to Los Angeles?
Well, it was mixed. It was a mixed bag. Those of us who had our best years in Brooklyn, I came up in '48. I think I won 118 games in Brooklyn, and I had some of my best days at Ebbets Field. And moving west, I was toward the end of my career, as was Pee Wee, Duke, Gil Hodges. Of course, Campy had been injured that winter. He was now paralyzed from his neck down from an auto injury. So, and Jackie had already retired at the end of the '56 season. So in '58, when we moved to Los Angeles, the two guys that loved the move, or maybe three, was Koufax, who was a rookie in '55, and Drysdale, who came to us in '56. Those two players their best years were yet to come. And young Johnny Padres, who was the hero in the '55 series, winning 2 games. They all three were more or less at the beginning of a real outstanding Hall of Fame career. The rest of us, we were like, these people don't know who we are. We got to prove it all over again. So it was a tough move for what you would call the boys of summer.
Is there one memory, let's say, forget the World Series or anything else, that you want to, one story you can tell us about pitching in Brooklyn or your teammates or anything else?
Well, of course, I said Brooklyn got to be a very close-knitted neighborhood. And if I'd pitch a good ball game in Brooklyn, I'd come out to Lafayette Walk, which I remember was between 3rd and 4th Avenue in Brooklyn, in Bay Ridge. Lived at Lafayette Walk. When I'd come home after the ball game, normally a day game, the neighborhood would decorate the trees with balloons and whatever. They make a big celebration, have a street dance, all that for a win in Brooklyn. So those were precious times. Our babysitters came from the neighborhood. We knew a lot of the neighbors. I've told the story many times about Abe Meyerson. Abe Meyerson owned a deli just near us, just down the block. And if I pitch, win or lose, he was at my door the next day with 2 bags of deli groceries. And I'd say, Abe, you can't, let me pay you. No, you can't give it. You can't pay. You shouldn't pay anything in Brooklyn. You're one of the Dodgers. So that was kind of the close-knit neighborhood we had in Bay Ridge. So that was very special.
Now, here's one thing I just want to make a comment. You pitched your entire career for the Dodgers, no other organization. That doesn't happen much today.
Well, we didn't have free agency in those days. And under the old rules in the contracts called a reserve clause, the team that signed you officially and technically owns you forever. The only way you could be freed if the club traded you, released you, sold you or something. But we had no individual rights as a player. We were to stay with the same team until the club, decided to either trade or sell you or release you. So, yes, I was fortunate. I don't believe in my 12th season I was ever under the threat even of being traded. And believe me, that's a big plus for a family, a player who has a wife and children, to not have to move to various cities and trades in baseball. And there were a lot of them because the Dodgers had so many players under contract. Mr. Rickey had the farm system. It was 26 farm teams, all the way from the lowest level all the way up through AAA to the majors. And so he had tons of players. And so if you didn't do well, if you weren't productive, you got either sent back to the minors or traded. So there was a lot of movement of guys going and coming. And I was fortunate. I felt like that I never was under the threat of being sold or traded.
What did you do after your baseball career was over?
I had a couple of offers. There was baseball expansion was underway, and I had a couple of the Mets. Were early '60s when that franchise was developed. So the Mets offered me a pitching coach contract. Actually, the New York Mets were trying to get as many former New York players to fill their rosters. And so I was offered a coaching job, and then I was offered the broadcasting job that Ralph Kiner ended up taking that job, and he was there for a long time.
Forever.
Yeah, he was. And Kiner was a class guy, and I used to kid him because he'd hit a home run or two off of me. And I said, Ralph, please, don't send a cab for me when you come to town. I'll get to the ballpark. You don't have to make sure I get there. But he was one of my nemesis. But yeah, so those offers were coming fast and furious. And an ad agency called me one day and said, Phillips Van Hughes and this shirt company, they're interested in talking to you about a position with them. So I went and checked it out, and they did offer me a real good contract. They were developing, they were a white shirt house, that they were developing a pleasure wear division, and asked me if I would come and be trained to head that division and hire other retired players of any sport. So Andy Robustelli is a name maybe you don't know, but played for the New York
Giants.
Football. Yeah. He was one.
Yeah, football Giants.
Yeah, and Jerry Coleman of the Yankees was one. Jim Hearn of the Giants.
Giants, New York Giants.
Yeah. So that was their concept. So I was already started in the training there. They offered me a real good contract, and then my fourth child was born, Jimmy, in April of that year, my first spring out, and Jimmy was Down syndrome. So that was a big shocker, and it really made it difficult to think about pulling up stakes in Anderson, Indiana, where my parents lived and my wife's parents lived. And so I had to tell Phillips Van Heusen that I was going to have to opt out of that opportunity because I just couldn't be on the road that much anymore with 4 kids, all under 12 years old, and Jimmy being a special child. So we decided to stay in Anderson, Indiana. So I developed an insurance business first. Then a bank came to town and offered me a chance to be on the board. And eventually I went in the bank, went through the chairs over the next 10 or 12 years, and I became president of the bank for the next 11 years. So I ended up a banker, which I never expected to be. But I did stay right here in my hometown of Anderson, Indiana.
Carl, again, we need to take a short break. Welcome back to Ask the Lawyer. With me, Mike Connors. We're talking to Dodger pitching great Carl Erskine. Okay, listen, some of us older guys here in New York, especially in Brooklyn, remember the boys this summer. And we thank you for what you brought to the history of Brooklyn. 1955, it's part of history. You can't take it away. And you guys did it for us.
Well, something happened recently that I'm extremely proud of. And I would like for everybody in Brooklyn to know that I have a great-granddaughter, 2 years old. My grandson said, Grandpa, I've got 2 little boys, but if I ever have a girl, I'm going to name her Brooklyn. So I have a great-granddaughter named Brooklyn. And there's a little newspaper in Brooklyn called it's a Catholic publication.
The Tablet.
The Tablet, that's it.
Yes.
And the writer there Jim Morini. I got in contact with him. I sent him a picture of me and my great-granddaughter, Brooklyn, and he published it just about the last 3 or 4 weeks. And I'd love for everybody in Brooklyn to know that I have a great-granddaughter named Brooklyn, because that's a very personal tie with me and the borough. And so I was very, very proud to be a Brooklyn Dodger.
Well, Brooklyn fans were very proud to have you as a Dodger.
Well, I knew a lot of fans. I played 10 seasons in Brooklyn. I got acquainted with a lot of people because I was a Brooklyn Dodger. There were a lot of fans that I, in one capacity or another, and I still get lots of mail. I can't believe it. I'll be 93 years old in December, so it's many decades ago that I actually got to play in Brooklyn. But those fans write to me, and some of them don't live in Brooklyn anymore, but they were in Brooklyn at the time I was playing. I answer all my mail. I'm just very devoted to the fans that write to me. And so for a skinny kid in Anderson, Indiana, to get to play on the big stage and with the greatest team, I think one of the great teams of all time, my catcher, Campy, I must have pitched 1,500 innings to Roy. My roommate was Duke Snyder. We became close as brothers. And then Jackie became a close friend. Pee Wee Reese, a very close friend. Gil Hodges was also from Indiana. One of the neatest things that I remember about Brooklyn, we had an organist named Gladys Gooding, and she was very well known in the music circles in New York. But she would play appropriate songs. She used to play a lot of appropriate to whatever the batter did or something. But Gil Hodges from Indiana, Erskine from Indiana, whenever Hodges hit a home run or I came in to pitch, she played Back Home in Indiana. And that was the most played song other than the national anthem in the 40s and 50s. So that was another tie that I had with Brooklyn. And so we had, like the butcher, Joe Rossi. I used to go to New York after my playing days, and I always called Joe Rossi and said, Joe, could you cut me some more of those Italian veal cutlets? And he'd meet me at the airport with a 10-pound sack all fixed up to carry. And so for years I had contact with a lot of people in Brooklyn.
Well, you still remembered. A lot of people remember you. Carl, thank you for being on the show. Thank you for sharing your memories. It's really appreciated. And good luck to you. Good luck to your granddaughter, Brooklyn.
Well, that's a neat connection for me. And I'll tell you what, I pitched a lot of innings at Ebbets Field, and some of them weren't the best I had. And you get a boo now and then, but you know what? I had such a close feeling with the fans because Ebbets Field was a small ballpark, and you could hear the fans real easy talking to you on the mound. And of course, my name of Erskine was corrupted by the Brooklynese of Oiskin, but I'd hear the yells from the stands, Oisk, hey Oisk, throw it through his head. And this was quite a culture that was at Ebbets Field, and most pitchers hated to come into Ebbets Field to pitch because there was hardly any foul territory, and the right field was 297, and so it was a small ballpark. But I loved to pitch in Brooklyn because our team got a lot of runs at Ebbets Field. And they played great defense as well. But the only thing that I ever saw happen that was so remarkable, Stan Musial was one of the great hitters of that era, and he hit in Ebbets Field. He hit so tremendous that the fans at Ebbets Field began to cheer the enemy, Musial. He's with the Cardinals. But the Evans Field fans gave him the name Stan the Man. And but some of our players were a little irritated at the fans because they cheered Musial so much. He used to be tough on us. But all in all, I went back to Evans Field in 1960, early 60s. They were getting ready to demolish. They had the wrecking crew in, and they had a big wrecking ball painted white and put red stitches on it like a baseball. And so they had a ceremony. Campy was there in his wheelchair, and Ralph Branca was there, who lived in the New York area. So the three of us, former players, and they had the ceremony, and finally they swung the big wrecking ball over the visitors' dugout and dropped it. And it crushed the roof of the dugout. And that dugout, we used to look over there, and that was the enemy in that dugout. But when they dropped that ball, I said, I got to go. I've seen enough. And I couldn't stay for the rest of the demolishing. But Evans Field, it still lives. It's still very vivid to a lot of people who visited there. I get letters from kids say, Carl, I was 10 years old. The first game I ever saw was at Evans Field with my dad, and you pitched a no-hitter, and here's the scorecard. You'll send me the actual scorecard, and I'll send it back to them and tell them, you got to keep this yourself. You and your dad were at it. So just a lot of carryover. I'm amazed at this time of my life that there's still such a connection and a carryover with the Brooklyn Dodgers.
You know, I almost hate to ask this question, but how many guys are still alive from the 1955 Dodgers?
3. You won't believe this. Duke Snyder and I used to keep track, looking at the big picture of the championship team. The players that are left, we just lost Newcomb not too many months ago.
Yeah.
He made it 4. But now living, Roger Craig, who was a rookie in 55, he won one of the games of the 4 in 55. Sandy Koufax, who was a rookie in 55, and Erskine. That's the 3 left, and they're all 3 pitchers. I don't know what that means, but there's just 3 of us left off of the roster. And that included coaches, manager, trainers, broadcasters, bat boy. They're all gone except those 3.
Everybody knows Sandy Koufax, but, you know, I think one of the remarkable things, Roger Craig has been on the show too, but one of the most remarkable things was the number of World Series with different teams.
Oh, Roger Craig?
Yeah, between being the Cardinals in '64, being a coach for the Tigers, manager for the Giants, or whatever.
Yeah. Well, Roger was a real baseball mind, and, you know, he was responsible for a lot of pitchers. He was a great pitching coach. He'd been a pitcher. There was a time, believe it or not, until the mid-'50s, that all pitching coaches used to be catchers. It was an assumption that they could tell what the guy's throwing and so forth. But only Jim Turner was the first pitcher who became a pitching coach, and he saved 2 guys that were hard throwers. They were traded from Baltimore. It was Bob Turley and pitched a no-hitter in the World Series.
Don Larson.
Those 2 guys were hard throwers, and the Yankees picked them up in a trade. And Jim Turner was the one who helped them change their pitching position. Instead of a wind-up, they pitched from the belt. Now, that's what you see most pitchers do today. But Jim Turner, a pitching coach, who was a former pitcher, he got Larson and Turley. He took away all the extraneous motions, pitching from the belt, and they both Turley actually became a better pitcher than Larson, but Larson pitched a phenomenal game in '56 in the World Series. So pitching coaches were now dominant in all teams, and that introduced the pitching count, the pitch count, and some other changes that have happened. That's because pitchers are now coaches in the majors, and they weren't until about the mid-1950s.
Who was on your coaching staff for the 55 Dodgers? Everybody knows Alston was the manager, but who were your coaches?
Billy Herman, former major leaguer infielder. Joe Becker. Joe Becker was a pitching coach. We had an old gentleman named Jake Pittler, first base coach. I think that's the coaches I remember anyway. I don't want to get off the phone here without saying what a remarkable honor. I got a surprise that the street was named Erskine Street in Brooklyn. I had 6 guys on my team made the Hall of Fame. I didn't make the Hall of Fame, but I got the best deal.
Well, you're driving down the Bell Parkway, and, to be honest, you just talked. I didn't think it was named for you, and I'm sorry. I apologize. But you're driving down the Bell Parkway. It's right there.
Well,
Erskine Street.
I didn't know it either until a couple of fans wrote to me and asked me, and I didn't know. I thought it was a coincidence. But a writer in New York was asked a question, was that named after the old pitcher? And he put an article in the paper, which somebody sent to me, and said, yes, that was named after Erskine, Carl Erskine, a pitcher, because there were several Brooklyn Dodger fans on the safety board or whoever is responsible for naming the streets. And so, yeah, they said yes, that those Brooklyn fans that had the authority to do it, they named it Erskine Street. So.
Right, because if you're driving on the Bell Parkway, I don't know if you do, you pass by the Gil Hodges Memorial Bridge, and a couple of miles later is Erskine Street.
Yeah, Jackie's got a bridge or something named after him.
Yeah, Interboro. The old Interboro Parkway is now Jackie Robinson Parkway.
Yeah, there you go. Well, anyway, that's that street and my great-granddaughter, those are two ties that I'm extremely proud of. Most players don't get to have the honor that I have received from the Dodger fans in Brooklyn.
Okay, well, you deserved it. You had a great career for us pitching here in Brooklyn.
Well, I tell you what, I thank the good Lord every day that I was able to. I married my high school sweetheart, and we've been married 72 years, and I've had
God bless you.
Kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, and you never lose the tag. I don't care how old you get. You never lose the tag if you've been a major league player. And so I am extremely thankful and grateful that I'm just a skinny kid. I wasn't very big. I was 5'10" and a half and pitched at about 165. But I was wiry and durable. I could pitch extra innings or whatever, and was just blessed in dozens of ways. But one of the big blessings is to have me think about how could it be possible that a skinny kid from Anderson, Indiana, end up playing with some of the greatest team members that ever played baseball. I believe there was 6 Hall of Famers on the Dodgers. I may be counting Alston as a manager too, but that era, quickly, I'll tell you why I say it's the golden era of baseball. There were 3 teams in New York City. We went from day games to night games. We went from trains to planes. We went from radio to TV. It was the years of integration with Jackie, and we went from East Coast to West Coast. That all happened in the decade of 47 to 57. And so I claim that as the golden era of baseball.
Thanks for the memories.
You bet. Thanks for calling me anytime. I appreciate reminiscing with you. That gave me a great feeling.
All right. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you
for being on the show.
Thank you so much.